Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. This week, I'd like to touch on something that is fairly fundamental to both the world and Chronicles of Darkness, but it really became a lot more obvious once Chronicles came out and that system started, well, becoming the new standard by which we run these games. And while this is not inappropriate for players to think about, it is very necessary for storytellers, because the mindset, the gear shift that you need to have in order to really make the game work can be difficult, especially if you're coming from a background that is more focused on, well, more simulationist or strategic games. I've said this before on previous episodes of the channel, but while lots of folks started with World of Darkness, maybe Vampire or Werewolf was one of their first RPGs, a lot of us who get into the hobby, we start with some edition of Dungeons & Dragons or one of its various clones. And those games have a lot of baked-in assumptions to them, and even if we know academically that we're playing a very different game, sometimes we can bring those assumptions with us, and it can, well, lead to problems with our narrative, with our style, and with our story. Now, as an example, let's look at more traditional fantasy stories in that the way that they generally function is players pick a class, they go on an adventure, whether it's a dungeon delve or whether it's an escort mission, something like that. They fight the monsters, they get the loot, they use the loot to buy better equipment, and they use the XP to go up in level. Eventually, you reach the capstone level of the game, and the story is over. Compare and contrast that with Chronicles of Darkness. Mechanically, players are still earning XP. However, we have more of an a la carte system of you take your XP and then you use that as your currency to buy whatever upgrades it is that you want. So whether you want your character to get stronger, whether you want them to acquire new powers, whether you want them to literally acquire currency in the case of the resources merit, whatever you become is entirely up to you. And that difference is very illustrative, because it is also the difference in a lot of the thinking. It is the difference in a lot of the setup that we have. Because, as most folks know, there is plenty of combat to be had in the Chronicles of Darkness if you want it. But that combat is not simulationist, in much the same way that lots of other aspects of the game are not simulationist. And for folks who have not heard that term before, if you think of a Dungeons & Dragons combat, you roll initiative, everyone starts, what usually happens? Well, you take your mini, and you put it down on the grid map, and now all the directions you can move in, everything you can see, all the lines of effect you have, those are determined by lots of those little numerical rules and regulations that we have. And that goes back to the game's origin as a tabletop war game. But Chronicles of Darkness and its earlier parent World of Darkness were never designed like those games. So in these games, yes, you have cover, you have concealment, you have general ranges for your weapons, but these are more general things. We don't have, for example, if you're moving into combat, if you're moving out of combat with an individual in melee, you don't have to worry about them getting an attack of opportunity on you. That's not a thing that exists in this game. If you're worrying about, what specific bonuses do you get for where your placement is or exactly how far away you are, these are lots of considerations that just don't exist. And for that reason, I have found it is important to think of both combat, and soon we will discuss other parts of the game, from a cinematic viewpoint, as if you are a director making a film. Because, as lots of folks know, the World of Darkness drew on a lot of media inspirations. Forever Night is one of the ones that comes to mind. However, there are lots of other things that are worth thinking about when it comes to how these games are structured, how things happen, and whether it's things like The X-Files, the much more recent Supernatural, or even movies like John Wick. These all have a similar tone, a similar aesthetic, but more importantly, they have a similar structure. And it is important to consider that structure when you're being storyteller, when you're setting things up. To continue with the example of combat, ask yourself not, how would I run this if it were a simulationist game where I'm trying to realistically determine who would win in a fight against a vampire? Ask yourself, how would I shoot this if I were directing a Dracula film? How would I film this if I were wanting to do a high-octane, human soldiers versus werewolves movie? And once you start thinking of it in those terms, you start thinking of it in scene setup, you start thinking of it in set design terms, you start thinking of it in action beats or in things like that, the game flows a lot more smoothly, because when you're looking for mechanics that aren't there, when you're looking for it to reflect a philosophy that does not exist, it can get really clunky. But when you start taking it in terms of cinema, when you start taking it in terms of story, or even how one would sit around the campfire and tell urban legends, suddenly you get a much smoother flow. And this is something worth keeping in mind as a storyteller, because often we're thinking of it in terms of a game, we're thinking of it in terms of rules and roles and numbers. But those things are just the underlying fairness, the structure, for whether or not your players succeed. The way that you should be viewing it and the way that, really makes it come home for players is in the language of storytelling and the language of film. I talked about this previously when I discussed how I disagree with the beat system. But again, even in that situation where I disagreed with the mechanic and how it was structured, I understand what the designers were going for. A story beat is meant to bring the players into the idea that you are all telling a collective story, and that this is, in its own way, a cinematic experience, and it keeps them thinking in terms of that structure, whether it's, characters achieving goals in a given session, in much the same way that if you were watching an episode of a TV show, there would be something a character is trying to do in that episode. It might be connected to something that had happened in previous episodes. It might be utterly unconnected and it's just the joke for today's episode. There's going to be something they're trying to do. There's going to be character development bits that hit. There's going to be long-term stories that get paid off. That's all part of the language of how film works and how storytelling works. And if you embrace that, and if you really think of it in those terms, even if you use certain systems over others, as folks who go back and watch the older video will see, I definitely recommend not using the beat system as it's written, and instead using the version that we saw in Deviant the Renegades. It's still good for your mind and good for how you structure things as a storyteller. Another good example of this for folks who've been following my blogs on the subject over on Improved Initiative, I've been writing about these social maneuvering mechanics that we have in Chronicles of Darkness. And if you haven't read those rules, you don't know what they are. The social maneuvering system is essentially when you have the situation in a game where a player or all your players want to influence an NPC, to give them something, do something, build a relationship, achieve a goal. This is for sort of a long-term social manipulation, or a long-term social persuasion if you don't actually want to be manipulating someone. But the idea is the same of you have a series of events where you have to earn that person's trust, you have to earn their respect, you have to persuade them to give you the thing that you want. And this will be more or less difficult depending on the personal willpower of the individual involved, the skills that you're using to persuade them, what your exact goal is, etc., etc. But when this happens, the storyteller sets a number of doors that you must pass through, and each door represents a different interaction that must be passed successfully. And that sounds very complicated for some folk, but generally speaking, think of it in terms of a movie montage. If it was an action film, you would have characters, going around, meeting contacts, getting the various weapons together, planning their assault. If it was a heist movie, you'd have them acquiring the various tools, you'd have them casing the joint, you'd have them talking with whoever it is that is their man on the inside. If it was a rom-com, you'd have individuals going on dates, having laughs, getting in that little lovers food fight that for some reason was a thing in the 90s. All of these things provide a structure that players and us as storytellers are very familiar with because we've all watched movies where this has happened. We're all familiar with this device. And as soon as you take that familiarity and you layer it over this mechanic, suddenly it becomes even smoother. Everyone understands what's happening, everyone knows what they're trying to do here. Now you're just asking them to roll the dice to find out whether or not this montage has the appropriate ending that they want it to have. And when you start thinking of things in this way, your job becomes so much easier as a storyteller. And it is something I recommend doing not just for specific mechanics, not just for particular setups, but how you think about your sessions, how you structure them, how you take notes, how you run them. Because when you think of the characters, not just as these are the PCs and I'm trying to give my players a fun story to follow, think of it in terms of if you were running whatever season of a supernatural TV show. What would they be doing? What sort of threats are they facing? What kind of pacing do these threats have? And once you have some idea of what's going on here, once you know your genre, once you know the sort of story your players want, you can structure it appropriately. For example, if you want to do a Monster of the Week style game, Hunter the Vigil is best for this, in my opinion, but you can theoretically do it with any of the games in the Chronicles of Darkness. Ask yourself what the monster is. How scary is it supposed to be? What exactly are my players supposed to be doing, and is this more of a action-oriented smash mouth, kick in the door and fight the monster sort of scene? Or is this a scene where we're going to have lots of research, we're going to be talking to various individuals who may have more occult knowledge than they think? Do we have to make bargains with various creatures and persons in the supernatural community in order to get their help? Do we want high tension? Do we want mystery? Once you know the genre, once you know the conventions, you could actually just head over to TV Tropes and ask yourself, all right, which building blocks are we going to use to structure this session or this particular arc of the Chronicle? And once you do that, you're pretty golden, because now you're using a language of storytelling that even if folks don't know it by name, even if they're not familiar with exactly how the tropes work or exactly how the pacing works or what the names for these particular tricks are in the film industry, they're going to recognize what they're seeing, and it's going to be very easy for them to take it in, even if they're unfamiliar with particular storytelling conceits, because the language of storytelling is meant to be consumed. And that just makes your life so much easier, and it makes these games work so much better. And again, if you need actual research, I would recommend looking up any of the shows that I mentioned, watching any of the films that I mentioned, whether it's Underworld, whether it's the John Wick series. Look at how they're structured. Look at the underlying structure of what happens, the challenges the main characters have to face, how they overcome those challenges, and what sort of difficulties they have to deal with in the time between action beats, the time between story beats. Because even if you have characters who are getting into a lot of fights, even if you have characters who are being chased constantly by supernatural threats, it's important to ask yourself what things matter in this story and what things really don't. Because again, the Chronicles of Darkness, and by an extent, the World of Darkness, are really not simulationist. They're not looking to measure how much gear you're carrying at any given moment. They're really not concerned with exactly how many beatings have you taken, unless that is a part of the story and you want that to reflect the challenges that your character has to operate under. And that really is a decision for you. Whether it's horror films or sci-fi TV shows, the underlying structure of storytelling and the cinematic experience you get watching them is probably one of the best tools that you can internalize for these games, and it is something I highly recommend, because when I flipped the switch in my mind and I stopped trying to account for every single piece of cover, every single, meter of range, every particular round in the magazine, my life got a lot easier as a storyteller, and my players seem to be having more fun, because, well, folks are not here to play these particular games, usually, to worry about range increments and to measure exact loads. They're here for cinematic storytelling. They're here to be part of a dark soap opera. And if you can deliver that kind of experience, players are going to come back every time. But that's my thoughts for this week. As always, let me know in the comments if there's a particular area of the World of Chronicles of Darkness you'd like me to cover, if there's a particular part of the rules that you're interested in, or if there's just something that I haven't touched on yet in this show that you feel deserves its own episode. But as always, like, share, subscribe, make sure that as many folks are picking up what I'm laying down as possible. And until next time, happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Ezekiel Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.